and welcome to the Global Leadership Podcast, where leaders of all sorts come to grow and expand their influence in healthy and holistic ways. I'm Whitney Putnam, your host of Season 8 of the podcast, and we are so glad that you are part of the podcast community. This month, I am really excited because we are going to cover one of my favorite topics, the topic of communication. Communication is so important to leaders because it's how we ensure our teams have caught the vision, are running in the same direction, and are also feeling seen and heard. Today, I have the joy of getting to chat with David Ashcraft, the president and CEO of the Global Leadership Network. He's going to be sharing some insights he gained over 3 decades as a communicator as a senior pastor of LCBC Church, and about that one time that he passed out on the stage. You're not going to want to miss it, so keep on listening to learn how you can grow as a communicator and a leader. Well, happy September, David. It's good to have you on the podcast
You as well,
today.
Whitney. Good to talk to you.
Absolutely. And we're entering into fall. David, I'm curious, just as I get to know you and all of our listeners and our podcast community gets to know you, do you have a favorite season? Do you like moving into the fall?
You know, I lived in Texas for most of my life. Well, I shouldn't say that. Up until I was about 33. And we really didn't have seasons in Texas. It was real hot, and then it wasn't hot. We're kind of the two seasons, which you live in Dallas now, so you know that. And so one of the things we loved moving to Pennsylvania was just the 4 seasons. And what's nice is by about the time you're tired of the heat or the cold, then it changes. And so, you know what? Spring, fall, this is a great time of year right now. It's beautiful. So
I love that. And I like you said, it moves into the different seasons. David, I was just talking about this with a friend. Texas, since you know, it's like it's cooling off right now. The temperatures are cooling off, but we just know that's pretend fall. We'll get real fall here in a little bit because it'll heat back up. You know, it goes back and forth. But I love that Pennsylvania has seasons for you. So
it does,
so
yeah.
nice.
So the variety is great. We enjoy that very much.
I love that. Well, we are in September, and we are talking all about communication in September. So all of our podcasts, you have an opportunity. You're going to get to be interviewing some really, really incredible guests about communication, David. And we know, and I know that you know because you teach us this at the GLN, good communication is so critical for the leader, knowing where people are coming from, what their expectations are. And several GLS speakers this year actually spoke about communication. So we had Kendra, Erwin, and Coach K all talk about communication from the GLS stage this year. What stood out to you?
You know, Whitney, I loved all 3 of those speakers. I loved Kendra and her focus just on stories. And I think sometimes we underestimate the power of stories. And as a communicator, we typically have information we want to get out, and sometimes stories get in the way of getting that information out. And so we think the most important thing is that I got everything communicated or out that I wanted to communicate, when in reality people may not be hearing it on the other end. And so Kendra's emphasis on stories and the impact. And you know, what's funny, as a pastor, oftentimes people will remember your good stories. They don't remember why you told the good story. So it's always that frustrating thing of, is it worth telling the story or not? But they remember the stories. And then you want to reuse stories, but they remember the good ones. They don't the bad ones. So it's always interesting.
That is so true. Everybody's nodding their head as they're listening along because they remember their pastor stories or a great podcast story or whatever. They remember the story. That's so true. And I love your humility in that, David, because I'm sure you heard many a times the story you told and not necessarily the point that you were trying to get
And you know
across.
what else happens a lot is they'll remember the story and they'll come up with a whole different point than what you meant when you told the story. And they'll say, you were speaking directly to me, and then they'll tell you what they think the story was about. And it's like, that was not what I was saying. But typically I don't say that. I just smile and say, good, that's great. So
I love that. Yeah, we just smile and nod. They got something. They got something out of it, David.
Exactly.
That's good. That's good. So I'm super curious, and I'm sure people are super curious as they're getting to know you more and more as GLN CEO and president. Erwin Raphael McManus talked about communication frequencies. So there's 7 communication frequencies. I thought this was fascinating. So after you listen to Erwin talk about them, David, do you think you know yours?
Well, you know what's funny, Whitney? I tend to not like the categories because people pigeonhole you into certain categories, whether it's communication or personality categories. But as we were listening to Erwin talk, and I actually first heard him back in February when he was going through that, I leaned over to Ruth, my wife, and asked her what she thought I was, and instantly she said, "You're the commander." I think is the one that it is, and so I don't know that I'm purely that, but apparently that's at least what other people around me think, and affirmed actually with my children, that my kids, they heard Erwin then at the summit this year, and they concurred that that was what they think I am as well. So
That's so interesting. And listen, I think you're so wise in leaning over to your wife or leaning over to a confidant and saying, "Hey, like, what do you think I am?" And then I love that Ruth immediately knew, nope, this is who you are. That's so great.
now, did you listen?
She knew.
Did you
She knew.
listen and think through who you are?
So yeah, what was interesting is my whole team that I get to work with, I have the joy of working with, they immediately looked at me as we were listening to Erwin share and they said, "You're the
Okay.
motivator," which is true through and through, David. I'm just a cheerleader at heart. I'm just gonna hopefully pull out all the good and make you feel really good about it moving
Good.
forward.
That's
So
good.
that's who I am. I know. But like I love that too, because you're, even you being able to say, I don't want to necessarily be pigeonholed. I think Erwin was so good about saying, our frequencies are going to come out at different places. So I'm sure I'm going to see you play out different parts of that, and you're going to see me play out different parts as
Well, and I
well.
think Whitney,
I'm
I was gonna say, I
curious.
think if
Yeah, go
we
ahead.
listen to what he was
Yeah.
saying as well, our we have to change how we communicate depending on our audience. And so I think a big point for him was, depending on what frequency your audience is at, that's how you need to communicate to them. And so being careful not to just stick in that one lane that we happen to be in. So
Right. I love that so much. So I think, okay, David, you have led for so many years and you're such an excellent communicator. So tell us how you kind of navigate that. So when you go into a board meeting or if you're teaching from the stage as a pastor or a leader, how do you kind of navigate, this is who I'm communicating to and this is how I want to communicate? What does that look like for you?
yeah, well, that's one I probably wish I was better at that, Whitney, than I am. What's funny is that I would be labeled as the commander because my goal is always to go into any setting, present an idea or information, and I want whoever my listener is to come to a conclusion on their own and come up with their own idea, or at least they think it's their idea. It's mine that I'm pushing, but I want them to think it's their idea and walk away going, "Man, I came up with this great thought or idea that I'd never thought about before," when actually that's the one that I'm trying to communicate to them. So I'm always trying to figure out where they are and how do I get them to think that it's their idea. So I don't know if that's motivator or manipulator. I'm not sure even that that's a category for him, but that's always my goal.
Both start with M's. We don't
Exactly.
know.
Exactly.
Yeah. I love that so much. Well, and do you see any difference too, David, if you're communicating from, let's say, a stage or you're communicating around a table, let's say with your team? Do you see that play out differently for you or not necessarily?
I still have that same goal of whether it's around the
Yeah.
table, I want everybody else to think they came up with the idea.
Yeah.
So I don't know that it changes that much. In a
Hmm.
larger setting, for me as a communicator, I think I'm better the more people know me relationally. And so there's that relational equity, and I think I do better. There's some speakers that are great. Just first time you hear them, they're amazing. And I would love to be that way. I don't know that I am. And so the relationships are important for me as well.
I certainly see that in you, David, and how you built relationships with the GLN staff and just building that relational equity. I see that in you. So as a past, and so before obviously stepping into this role, which you're now, it's been a birthday. You've had a birthday with the
Yeah.
GLN. You're past
A
1 year
year
old.
and maybe 3 or 4 months now. So yeah, feel very
I love
seasoned in
that.
the seat. Yeah.
Yes. And for people that are just getting to know you, you did serve as a pastor for 32 years previously to this role. And that role was obviously deeply rooted in communication. So over those years, what would you say, and it might be something you've already said, what was one of the biggest lessons you learned in communicating well?
I probably learned this from John Maxwell early on. Back in the early 90s, I would listen to John all the time. Whenever we would travel, we would take him on the road with us with cassette tapes back then, and then it was CDs. But he would always talk about there's communicators and then there are teachers, and he would distinguish between the two, and he'd say those that are teachers, their whole focus is getting information out to their listeners. But then there are communicators, and their whole thing is just making sure that the listeners understand and are changed by the information that's given. And so that was always my challenge, because I probably lean more towards the teacher side. Here's the information. And so there was always this struggle of, I've got the information, but too much is going to overwhelm the listener. And so just that balance and finding that all the time was a challenge for me.
Okay. That's so good. That's good wisdom though. I love that. Okay. Here's a really, really fun one. And I'm ready to hear it. Hopefully you have one. A communication blunder. Was there a time that you were like, oh man, I totally messed that up? Can you recall a time?
I don't know. I'm sure there were many times that I messed it up. I'm not sure that there were one that I remember specifically. I will tell you the most memorable time when I was teaching. We, for a lot of years, had 2 Saturday night gatherings, a 4 o'clock and a 6 o'clock, and then 2 Sunday morning gatherings. And I had been real sick all week long, but I thought, oh, I can do this. I can preach. And so I didn't really tell anybody I was sick. Ruth knew that I was. And so I got through the 4 o'clock gathering almost. And about 2/3 of the way through the message, I started feeling real faint. And at some point I just said, I think I'm about to pass out. And I did. And I was sitting on a stool, and I fell off the stool forward. And everybody thought that I had just died. And so they came running up on the stage and called an ambulance and all of that. And it was actually an interesting thing, because to their point, they thought I was dead at that point. So that wasn't me communicating, but it happened while I was communicating. So
David, oh my word.
yeah.
That's scary. That
Apparently
was
it was. I
scary.
didn't know at the time because I was out. So I just remember waking up, laying on the floor, and everybody being around me. And so then our worship leader, his name is Matt, and so he kind of ran up on stage and was trying to get people's attention and take it off of me. And so he decides to sing.
Right.
And so he decides to sing "It Is Well With My Soul," which I told Matt after the fact. I said, "That's a funeral song. That's not one you sing when I'm laying there on the stage." They're working on it. So anyway.
Oh my gosh, he didn't know what to do. Nobody knew what to do, David. Oh, that is a wild story.
Yeah.
Listen, that is wild. And all your congregation, that was memorable
It
for
was
sure,
very much
David.
so. Yeah.
Uh-huh. And then you came back the next week and you were
It was
ready
good
to go, I
Yeah,
bet.
exactly.
I love that so much. Oh, David, that's going to make probably a lot of our listeners just kind of giggle as they think about it more and more. They'll laugh, why do we laugh when people get sick? We shouldn't be doing that. But that was a wild experience for a congregation. Now this, I have learned this from you already, and I appreciate it so deeply when it comes to communication, your communication style, David. You really appreciate candor. So I've sat in meetings with you where you've said, hey guys, if there's something in the room that we need to get out or we need to work through as a team, let's work through it as a team. And I appreciate that so much from you. So have you always built cultures of communication like that with teams that you've been building, or is candor something you've learned along the way?
That's a good question. I probably have learned it on the way. I mean, when I was younger, in my early 20s, I worked, all the way through college, I worked in camps and was typically a leader, a program director to director at all these different things. And I did not appreciate confrontation back then. And so I knew if there was a counselor doing something they shouldn't be doing, or they weren't doing what they should be doing, I would avoid going in that area of the camp because I didn't want to have to confront them. And so I would walk all the way around just so I wouldn't have to see them and see what they were doing or not doing. So confrontation is not something that I've always enjoyed, but I've learned that it's necessary. And not that candor and confrontation necessarily are the same thing, but they go together. And I've just found over the years it's easier. I'd rather go ahead and get it out in the meeting while we're all together, or even just one-on-one, than waiting and having to deal with it after the meeting. And especially if there's a number of people in the room, then I've got to go around and have 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 conversations when I could just do it in one meeting in front of everybody else. So my goal is always to say, let's just be honest here and let's not play games. Let's be nice, but let's be honest with each other.
Yeah. Well, I have appreciated that so much. And how I've noticed that, David, move, because our team, now the team that I get to work with at the GLN, has actually adapted candor as one of our team values that we're working inside of. And because of your direction, your leadership, and when we keep our eye on moving the kingdom forward, and it's about the kingdom moving forward, we can have a lot more healthy dialogue. It's not about hurting somebody's feelings necessarily. It's about moving the mission forward.
And making the other person better or the situation better. And so when you realize that, and when you do address your comments in such a way that it is helping the other person grow or helping the team grow and be better, or avoid a mistake, or avoid some
Yep.
kind of trap that we might fall into, then you learn to appreciate it very much.
Yeah, definitely makes a person better. That's so good, David. Last question for you. So what are some communication habits that you think that every leader should have? Or is there one or two communication habits that you think every leader should be doing?
My background is Dallas Seminary, and one of the biggest things I felt like I learned there from a communication standpoint is state what you're trying to say, and then restate it again, and then restate it again. And so say it in several different ways, but keep repeating it. And I think our tendency is we think we've communicated something one time, and everybody's got it because I said it one time, and so how could they not have gotten it? And so whether it's in a message specifically, restating the points, I think is critical. I think also, vision, we all know vision leaks. And so if you don't keep restating it, then people are going to forget it. And so if there's a mistake we make is thinking we've said it enough when typically we need to say it more and more. And which also reminds me that, Whitney, one of my goals is always, growing up around Dallas Seminary, we would have seminary profs oftentimes teach at church, and everybody would always be in awe of that professor and what they had to say. And then in back hall conversations, you would say, well, what did they say? And everybody go, I don't know, but he was amazing, because what he said was so complicated. Then they're all impressed with that. Where I always thought it's if people understand it, that's what ought to be the focus. And so my goal is always to simplify as much as I can. And I can take the hardest principle, but until I can say it simply, then I don't have it in my head. And so people receive criticism for, oh, you're not deep enough, or things like that, because it's so understandable. Where the biggest compliment for me is people walk away and they'll talk about their kids, third, fourth, fifth grader that was in the gathering, and they understood the point. Then I go, great, I accomplished my goal. And so simplicity is huge.
David, thanks for sharing that with us. That was so good. Simplicity for the sake of getting clarity to the audience that you're serving.
Yeah. Are you trying to impress, or are you
David,
trying
thank
to
you.
communicate? And so I think those are two big different things. Yeah.
Oh, there you go. We could just sit on that. Are you trying to impress, or are you trying to communicate? David, I see this in you. I'm so grateful for your leadership, not only at the GLN, but to all those that we're serving, especially those in this podcast community. And so thanks so much for sharing just those insights with us. That's a lot for us to take and move forward in our own lives.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So thank
And
you.
I think this month, as we focus on communication, is going to be great. I love the talks that we're going to be focusing on and the interviews that we're going to be having. So I think this is one that's going to be very valuable to all of us.
Absolutely. David, thank you so much. And we can't wait for the rest of this month.
Sounds great. Thank you.
I loved that conversation with David. I think what I'm going to be pondering over the next couple of weeks is how communication isn't about making yourself sound impressive, but truly about connecting with others. I want that. I want that in my life. Hey, if you want to keep digging deeper into communication this month, make sure to check out our 365 resources. We know that you want to keep growing and stretching yourself as a leader all year round. And that's why we created 365 for you. You'll gain access to past summit talks, and all this month, the content on 365 is going to focus on, you guessed it, communication. So make sure to check it out at globalleadership.org/365. You can also find inspiring, relevant, and helpful content on how you can grow in your communication on all our social channels through September. So make sure to follow us on your favorite platform. Thanks, friends. I am so glad we get to be a part of this community together. And remember, when the leader gets better, everyone gets better.